All right, well, let's get started on the camera itself. We're going to start with the button layout, and we are just going to explore this camera from top to bottom, going around looking at what everything does on this camera. First off, there is the on-off switch that we have already played with. And when you turn it on, one of the things that happens that you don't really see happening is the camera has an automatic sensor cleaner. The CCD or the CCD sensor inside of it does occasionally get dust on it. It has an automatic cleaner on it that turns that on every time you turn the camera on and every time you turn it off. This is something that you can control if you don't want that to happen, and we will go into the menu system and we will pass by where that controls later on. Also, if you turn the off on and you turn it a little bit further, there is a spring-loaded light that turns a light on for the top LCD panel. So for low light situations, you can see what's going on in that top panel as well. The shutter release button right inside the middle, obviously this is where you are going to press to take the picture. Now everyone should be familiar with the fact that if you press halfway down, that is what kind of wakes the camera up, because normally if you turn the camera on, it's going to go to sleep after a certain period of time. Already in this class we've kind of forced it to stay awake longer than normal. But if your camera is kind of sleeping, you might say, the quickest and easiest way to wake it is to press halfway on the shutter release. This also activates the focusing system and the metering system, and then you'll press all the way down to take the picture, of course. Right next to that is a little symbol. It's got kind of like 5 little spots to it, and that is the metering symbol. And if you press that button, and as you press it you turn the back dial, you will have 3 different options on metering. We have matrix metering, center weighted metering, and spot metering. In general, I think matrix metering is a great all-around place to leave the camera for most of the time. Cameras used to have center weighted, so it has a long tradition. If you want to concentrate the light reading in the middle of the frame, you could do that. There is also a highly selectable spot where you can have all the information inside that a 3.5 millimeter circle. It's a very small area, and it is customizable. When we get into the custom menu on this camera, you can select the size of the spot if you're very particular about that. But for general use, the matrix metering measures over 1,000 points on the frame. It's measuring light intensity, it's measuring color, and it generally comes up with a pretty good average as far as what shutter speed, aperture, ISO you should be at. And so for general photography, I prefer leaving it in matrix. I think the second most useful one is spot, but your style may vary. And so this is one of those personal areas where different people use the camera differently. So next up, right beside that, is the plus minus button. This is the exposure compensation button. If you press that button and turn the main command wheel in the back, you will see a plus and minus changing in the viewfinder. And this is to basically brighten up your image or darken your image. And so I will give you a photographic example. If you are taking a picture and you're wondering maybe this would be better darker or lighter, and you're in a mode such as program, aperture priority, or shutter priority, the quickest and easiest way to lighten it or darken it up would be to dial in a minus number to make it darker or a plus number to make it brighter. Now you won't be using this if you use manual, because you'll be using it, you'll be making those changes directly with shutter speeds and apertures. But in any of the automatic modes, program, shutter priority, aperture priority, this is when you would use this mode. All right, back on the top of the camera, there's that little white indicator kind of in the back right-hand corner. That's just indicating the focal plane of where the sensor is in the camera. There are some special circumstances where people need to measure the distance from their subject matter to the focal plane, and that's how and where you would measure that. Not something most people are likely to encounter. Your main control panel is something that we will go through very closely in the display section on this class, so we're going to leave that. The hot shoe, this is where you will mount a dedicated flash or a number of other devices that you can hook up to the camera. It has a little plastic piece in there that just cosmetically keeps it nice and clean, but it's not completely necessary, so don't worry about it if you lose it. We have our flash unit. We'll be talking more about flash as we get to different areas on the camera. And then over on the left-hand side, we have the mode dial, which is a very important dial that is going to control a lot of the main features of the camera. So let's take a closer look at the mode dial. The mode dial is basically adjusting how shutter speeds and apertures are set, as well as a number of other features depending on which mode you're in. The manual mode, where many of you are right now, you will have control over shutter speeds, apertures, and everything on the camera when you're in this mode. It's my favorite mode to be in control of because you can make very precise settings and the camera doesn't go behind your back and make changes on you. So when it is in the manual mode, you will turn the front dial to change the aperture, and you'll turn the back dial to change the shutter speeds. Go ahead and check that out on your camera. Make sure that you're comfortable with that. It's a good system to have. You got two dials, each controlling something very important. Now, if you want to switch it over to the A mode, aperture priority, you will just turn the front dial to change the aperture. The back dial then will not do anything. And as you switch it to shutter priority, it's kind of just the opposite. The back dial is then active and the front dial is inactive because the back dial is controlling the shutter speed. If you put it into the program mode, you can control the what's called program shift by turning the back dial, and it will adjust shutter speeds and apertures within a limited range so that you can choose different combinations, but still apertures and shutter speeds are being chosen for you. You just get to have a little bit of discretion as to which area you want it to be in. Slower shutter speeds, faster shutter speeds, more depth of field, less depth of field. As we continue going around the camera, we next hit upon the full auto section. We have full auto and flash off auto. And these two modes are essentially the same, the only difference being in flash off, the flash will not pop up. In the full auto mode, the camera is going to set shutter speeds for you, it's going to set apertures for you, and it is going to pop the flash up whether you want it or not. It is going to automatically set a bunch of features on the camera whether you want it or not. I do not recommend this mode for any experienced photographer because it limits you on your control of what you can go in to the camera and do. If you're going to hand the camera to your cousin who doesn't know anything about your camera, it's a fine mode to use for that. But for any well-intentioned user of this camera, I would highly recommend one of the more manual modes. As we get below that, there is a scene mode. And this is one of the modes that we're not going to talk a lot about in this class. This is kind of a learning mode that if you didn't want to take a photography class, you could potentially go into the scene mode and learn a little bit more. But there's a lot of little picture modes in here. I'm going to talk more about the scenes in just a moment. As we go around the dial, we have U1 and U2. U2 has nothing to do with the band. These are user settings 1 and 2. You can customize this camera to work the way you want it to. Let's just say once in a while you coach some sort of athletic team and you shoot pictures of them. You could program in exactly all the settings you want, from the mode, the shutter speed, the metering system, the drive mode, into one of those systems for user 1. And then the other thing you do is you take pictures of your kids and you have a certain mode that you like using for taking pictures of your kids. You could dial all those settings in and program them into the U2 mode. That way, anytime you go into those situations, you simply flip the dial to that mode and it's your own personal customized mode. It's a very nice feature to have. So that scene mode, if you want to put your camera in the scene setting on the mode dial, if you turn the command dial on the back of the camera, you will see in the LCD monitor on the back of the camera all the different automatic scene modes. There are many cameras that have 3, 4, or 5 scene modes on the mode dial itself. This one has, I don't even know. It's got well more than a dozen different modes. I think it has 20-some modes on there, and you can just get to that by turning the dial, and you can see they have an example picture and a description of what that setting is doing. And these are designed for the person who has not taken a photography class, in my mind. A very simple way of letting the camera figure out all the things that you might have figured out. But I can tell you right now, the honest truth is that you can be much smarter than the camera with just a little bit of information. And so the scene mode is not one that I would recommend on this camera. It's, I'm sure, a very fine mode, but if you really want to harness the full capabilities, I would be more in the manual A for aperture priority, S for shutter priority, or P for program modes. It just allows you to do more on the camera. Next up, let's kind of take a look at the back side of the camera. Kind of there on the top, but more visible on the back, is the release mode. And it does have a lock pin, so it does take a little bit of a double finger. It works if you push down with your thumb and then turn your forefinger, turning the dial. There's a number of settings here, so let's look at what you can do here. This is controlling what happens when you press all the way down on the shutter release. S is for single. It'll take one shot when you press down on the shutter release. Continuous L is a continuous low mode, and you can actually select how many frames, anywhere from 1 frame a second to 5 frames a second. The continuous high mode will shoot at 6 frames per second, as long as you leave your finger down on the shutter release. This camera also has a Q mode for quiet situations. Anytime you want to be extra quiet when you are shooting your picture, maybe you're in a theater, maybe you're in a courtroom, what happens is it slows the motors down on the mirror and various mechanisms inside the mirror box to quiet the camera. And it does make it noticeably more quiet. So you may want to keep mind of that in certain situations. Next up is the self-timer mode, and this is one of those other modes that we can customize when we get into the menu system. You'll see where we can customize the length of time, but if you want to get in the picture yourself, you could do it there, or you could purchase the wireless remote and put it into the remote mode. That way you can trigger the camera without just having 10 or 20 seconds. You can have as much time as you want. And then finally, M up stands for mirror up. If you want to shoot this camera at slow shutter speeds and you want to make sure that the mirror does not cause vibration. And this is still a problem on SLRs, and I have a little example here to share with you. And what's going on is that when you shoot pictures in and around, say, 1/8 of a second, if you don't do mirror lockup, there might be a little bit of vibration from that mirror that causes a little bit of movement in the camera. And even if the camera's on a tripod, so you do have to be careful at the shutter speeds, and it can happen anywhere from 1/30 of a second down to about 1 second. That's kind of the critical area. But here in this example, you can see with it turned off on the left, it's not quite as sharp as it is when it's turned on the right. And so for those nitpicky photographers that want the maximum sharpness, this is that one extra thing that you can do to get the sharpest possible pictures. And that's our release mode. Next up on the back of the camera is the playback button. So we've all taken pictures. You can play your image back. You can see what's going on in the image. Now we're going to use a button that I haven't officially talked about. It's called the multi-selector. It's the round button over on the right-hand side of the screen. You will press to the right to get to the next picture and to the left to get to the previous picture. And you will also press up and down to pull up additional sets of information. And how much information you see may be more or less than I have right now. It depends on one of the menu settings that we will go through. You can customize and have different amounts of information displayed. I like having a lot of stuff that I can look at. That way I can look at everything from what my shutter speed and aperture was, to what are my blown out highlights, to what does my histogram look like, to what did my focus points see. And we'll get into more of that when we hit that section in the menu. Also, buttons that we haven't talked about yet are the ISO and quality buttons, but right now in the playback mode, they also work as zooming buttons. You can zoom in and out. You'll notice that there's little magnifying glasses. And one of the things that I will do when I take a picture and I want to make sure that it is really sharp is I will zoom in on it and then use the multi-selector to navigate around to see if my subject is really, truly sharp. And it's a great way to confirm sharpness after you've taken the picture, but before you've actually downloaded it onto a computer. So next to the play button is the garbage button. So if you have an image that you want to get rid of, you can play it, press the garbage button twice, and it will get rid of that image. Next up is the menu button. Let's go ahead and press menu. We already went in here and made one adjustment for some of the timers and menus. And this is something that we will be dedicating pretty much the second half of this class on, going through the menu system. So more to come on that. Right below that is a button that's got a number of different things that it does. The first and most important thing it does is it controls the white balance. And so when you press that button and turn the main command dial on the back of the camera, up in your top LCD, you will see different adjustments for white balance. And you can see all the different white balance settings listed here. And by changing the sub-command dial in front, you can make a fine-tune adjustment of the white balance going more amber or more blue. So this is the white balance button. If you turn the front dial, which is called the sub-command dial, you'll either get an A1, A2, up to A6 reading, or you will go from a B1 to B6 reading. This will change the color of the image on an amber blue scale. So if you want to adjust the white balance, you're not quite happy with Nikon's setting of what any particular feature is, you can adjust that. It is also the help and protect button. If you play an image back and you want to make sure that it doesn't get accidentally deleted, you can press the protect the key button there, and it will set that image to be locked so it cannot be deleted. And then the question mark is the help button. This is very handy if you're going through the menu system, as we will be in a moment. Because if you're not exactly sure what a particular feature does, you can just press that button down and it will give you more information about what that feature does. Let's talk a little bit more about white balance. White balance is an important feature on this, and what's kind of changed since the days of film is that your cameras don't inherently know what is white. It needs to try to be able to figure that out, and if it has a hard time figuring it out in an automatic way, you might need to manually tell the camera what sort of lighting conditions you are in. Natural lighting conditions like sunlight, cloudy conditions, and shady days all have different color temperatures. The light is a different color. Artificial lights like incandescent lights, including new compact fluorescent bulbs, are very orange in color. Fluorescents are not truly white. Flash, the built-in flash, is true to nature color, or other flashes are true in their whiteness to them. But you may need to make an adjustment if you are getting funky colors. Now there are a couple of other settings. There is a preset white balance. There is a menu setting that we will pass by where basically you photograph a white piece of paper and you let the camera know that that is what is a white piece of paper, and it will then calibrate the rest of the pictures from there on out at that setting. You also have an automatic white balance setting, which I think is fine for general photography. It is also fine if you're going to shoot in raw images, and raw is something we'll talk about in a moment. But auto white balance, first off, works pretty good. And secondly, if you shoot in raw images, it's just a good place to be in general, because with raw images you can adjust that later on. And then finally in here you'll have a K setting, which stands for Kelvin, because this is the Kelvin scale of color. And you can adjust it to the exact Kelvin number that you want. So if you were photographing in the same environment all the time, if you were in charge of taking pictures at work, and you always use the same lights, the same window, the same setup every time, and you somehow figured out what the color temperature was from previous attempts and working at it, you could set a very specific setting yourself. That way it stays standard on every time you shoot those pictures. So it's a nice option to have in there. Next button down on the list is the ISO and zoom button. We already saw what the zoom does in the playback mode. In the ISO mode, what you will do is that you will press the ISO button, and then you will turn the main command dial on the back of the camera to adjust your ISO. The settings on this camera will range anywhere from 100 up to what's called high 2. And let's go up to the highest number, 6400. High 1 is exactly one step above 6400, so it's 12,800. And high 2 is twice what high 1 is, and so that's that 25,000 number. And so ISO is very important because that is the sensitivity of the sensor. Now the best place to be to start with is the lowest numbered setting you have. So ISO 100 is a great place to leave your camera, or at least to start, because that is where your camera will get the best detail. So let's take a look at some examples here. At ISO 100, the sensor is getting as much light as it needs. As it goes up to 200, it's receiving half the light, 400, a quarter of the light. At 800, it's receiving 1/8 the light it would normally need. What the sensor is then doing is it is boosting the signal of what light it does have and trying to amplify that to get a good picture. The problem is that when you get it up too high, you get a lot of noise. And so you want to avoid shooting at high ISOs unless it's absolutely necessary. If you really have to get the shot and it's very important and you don't really care too much about the quality of the shot, then you would bump it up. But in general, I like to leave it at 100, and then I will bump it up as necessary, whether I need it for shutter speeds or apertures. And this is an area that gets a little bit complex for the newcomers, and this is where a photography class definitely helps out, and we're going to be a little shortchanged on time on discussing this further, but we will talk a little bit more about it in the camera operations section. And so that's the ISO. And to start with, right now at 100 is a fine place to be for this class. And then, of course, we use that button for zooming back on things that we have zoomed in on. Next up is the quality button. And if you press this button, leave your finger held in on it, and turn the main command dial, you will adjust the types of files that you are recording, whether it's a raw image or a JPEG fine, JPEG normal, or JPEG basic image. I prefer to shoot in RAW for all my important work. We will talk more about RAW and JPEG. But if you want the true information from the sensor, you will want to shoot in RAW. The disadvantage to RAW is that not everyone's computers can read it. You do need to have the right software. The camera is supplied with the right software, or programs like Lightroom will read it automatically and very easily. You can also shoot the camera in JPEGs, which is a more common format, or you can even shoot it shooting both RAW and JPEGs at the same time. With JPEG images, there's a lot of ways that you can control how large they are and how much information they are. JPEG images are compressed images compared to the raw images. And so they are processed, they're compressed to make them smaller, and you can adjust exactly how large or how small they are. One thing that you can do is you can control the image size. This one's pretty easy to figure out. This is simply a numbers game. The more pixels you have in there recording the image, the better the quality of the image. So if you do want to shoot JPEGs, I would recommend shooting large. That way you're taking advantage of the full 16 megapixels of this camera. On the file type, fine, normal, and basic is the compression, how much you want to compress the image. And if you shoot it in basic, it's compressing a lot of information down, and you're going to be losing detail in the image. And I wouldn't recommend it. It was something that we did in the days when memory cards were very expensive and we couldn't get very many images on a card. And now memory cards are much more affordable, so I would highly recommend shooting the best quality images you can. If you are going to shoot JPEG, I would shoot them large and fine. If you're going to shoot raw images, you're going to get the best quality possible. And we will talk more about this as we get through some of the menu systems. We have our main LCD on the back of the camera. It's a very high resolution monitor back there. In fact, it's a little higher resolution than an iPhone. And they talk about how great a resolution that has on it. So your camera does have a very good screen on it. As we move over to the right-hand side, we have a diopter, which is kind of halfway hidden up by the viewfinder. And this is really important to have this adjusted for your eyes. This is adjusting the viewfinder so that it's clear for you to look through. And the correct way to adjust this is to look through the viewfinder and don't really look at what your camera's pointed at, but look at the brackets or press halfway down on the shutter release so that you can see the data below the frame. And you want to make sure that that data is sharp and clear to see. If it's sharp and clear, then you have your diopter set right. You do have to be careful if you are sharing a camera with another person and they adjust it on you, or it gets adjusted as you move the camera in and out of your camera bag. Right next to that is the AEL button and the AFL. They're both imprinted on the same button there. It's kind of a dual purpose button, and this stands for auto exposure lock and auto focus lock. This is a button that is customizable on the camera. You can press that in and hold it to lock an exposure in if you want to recompose. But once again, we will see how you can customize this button to do other things when we get into the menu system so that you can get it to work exactly as you want it to. Right next to that, you'll see a grouping of little holes. That is actually the speaker. So when you record movies and you're listening to them back, that is the area you want to press your ear up against to hear what's going on. Our command dial, which we have been using for a number of functions, right there is used for a great number of things on this camera to change a variety of settings on the camera. It's the main dial that you probably want to go to. Next up, we have a spring-loaded switch called the Live View switch, LV. So let's talk a little bit more about shooting movies and going into live view. First off, when you go into live view, there is an information button. And if you press that information button, you will see different bits of data brought up on screen, depending on how much information you want when you're looking through the live view. And so go ahead and press the information, and either you want a whole bunch of data, you can have grid lines, you can have a pretty cool virtual horizon in your camera. Let's see if I can get this set up for our camera here. I kind of like that virtual horizon. I'm often tilting the camera unintentionally, and this can help you level it out. So it's a nice feature. And just pressing the information button to pull up the information that you want. First thing. Secondly, when you have the camera in the live view mode, the way the camera works in autofocus is very different than when your camera is taking normal still photographs. The first thing is, what are you focusing on? And this is the AF area mode. Now, a button that we haven't officially talked about down here on the side of the lens, side of the camera, it's called the AF and M button. It's the autofocus button. By pressing that button in and turning the dial in front, we can change, I'm going to change information modes here. Unfortunately, it doesn't show this up real big, but I will do it here. Anyway, it changes the area that we're going to focus. We can start with normal, which is a fairly small box in the middle. We can go to wide, which is a larger box. We have a facial recognition mode that can recognize faces. And then we have a subject tracking mode, which can track different subjects moving around, potentially, say, kids running around in front of the camera. So you can play with those different modes for selecting how the camera or what the camera is going to focus on. Now, how the camera focuses is the focus mode. It's the same button, but it's the dial in the back of the camera. And here is where we change from single to full time. And if you look in the back of the camera, you'll see an AFF or an AFS. S stands for single and F stands for full time. In single, the camera will focus basically on the first solid object that it can find. And with full time, it will continually readjust to find what's new and in focus. In general, when you're shooting in live view or in the movie mode, the camera doesn't focus real well. It's just an inherent disadvantage with the live view system on the current digital SLRs. They're designed for focusing when the mirror is down, and to work in live view, the mirror is up and it's using a system that, well, isn't the best system for focusing. And so if you're shooting movies, the recommended technique for most cinematographers and film buffs is to pre-focus ahead of time. And it's kind of hard to do a lot of focusing while you are shooting a video or in the live view mode. It's easier to do it just manually ahead of time, and be very careful about setting up your shot so that it doesn't change. You don't have a big need for focusing up close and changing that focus, because you would probably have to do that manually, and it gets a little tricky to do that. So it's a challenge working in the live view and movie mode for focusing. Now, to actually record a movie, there is a button right in the middle. It's an orange button. You will simply press that button to start recording. You'll get a red record in the top left, and that indicates that you are recording a movie. On this camera, you can record up to about 20 minutes of continuous video coverage. And then you press the button once again to stop. So it's once to get it going and once to stop. Now, this camera can shoot a number of different types of video modes. The movie size, how many pixels are being recorded, what's the final file size. It does record in what's called full HD, which is 1920 by 1080, HD, which is 1280 by 720, and it does that at a number of different frame rates depending on which system you have it set up for, NTSC or PAL. And then it also records a very small size if you want to record something to send on the through emails or on YouTube or something on the internet very, very easily. And you will see where these movie sizes are set as we get through into the menu system, and it is recording them in a .mov format. So it's a pretty common format. Continuing on the back side of the camera, we have our multi-selector. This is basically, I sometimes might call it the mouse pad. It's basically how you navigate through various functions of the camera, up, down, left, and right. Kind of its inherent thing that it is doing is it's selecting focus points. If you select one focus point, you can just start tabbing on this to select a different focus points within the frame. In the middle of that is our OK button. Anytime we are in the menu system, we want to lock something in, we'll generally just press the OK button to exit that feature. Right next to that is an infrared receiver. There's a wireless infrared remote that you can get, and it works on the front of the camera and it works on the back of the camera, and that's the little sensor that it needs to see. The focus lock selector, the multi-selector that I just talked about controlling the focus points. Some people accidentally hit that with their nose or their finger and they want to lock that off. Well, that's a little lock switch for that switch. If you have that locked, it's not going to be active. And so you have to be careful about hitting that switch. Our card light right next to the information button indicates that information is being written to the card. So as you take a picture, and let me make sure I can take a picture right now. Very long picture. Let me take a bunch of pictures here. You can see the light come on as it's writing information to the memory card. It won't stay on very long unless you are shooting maybe a burst of series. When you're writing a movie, for instance, it may stay on for a couple seconds after the movie is done recording. The information button is just generally going to pull up a bunch of information. If you just hit it right now, it's going to show you your shutter speed, your aperture, and where a bunch of settings are on the camera. Now we're going to go through this screen here in just a moment, so we'll explain what all of that information in there means in just a moment. Over on the left side of the camera, we have more buttons and controls. Up at the very top, we have our flash button, as well as our flash exposure compensation button. You can see the little symbol above it with the lightning bolt and the plus minus. That's the flash exposure compensation. But let's talk about the flash first off. So if you are in a dimly lit situation and you shoot a picture without flash, you are very possibly going to get a blurry picture because you have too slow of shutter speed. There are a couple of ways of fixing this. One is to raise your ISO to a higher setting, but as we've already mentioned, that gives you the problem of noise or this kind of grainy look to your image. And so one option you have is to keep your ISO low, pop up the flash, and use the built-in flash. It's very convenient for any time when you want a little extra light. It's right there and very easy to use. Now, just kind of some things to think about on flash. Flash is not good for things that are really, really distant. It's good for things that are right in front of you, and the light falls off, well, rather quickly as you move further away from the camera. And so in this shot, penguins standing pretty close to the camera are pretty well illuminated with the flash, but back 20 or 30 feet, they're not getting much light from the flash. And so you do have to have things pretty even right in front of you when you shoot flash. One of the best times to use flash is when you would almost least expect it. So on a cloudy day outside, you can take a nice portrait, but if you add a little bit of fill flash, it's going to add a little bit more light into the eyes. And it is a good technique, adding a little bit of fill flash, even though there's plenty of light. And this is very true even on a sunny day. Sunny day is a very hard time to shoot portrait pictures because of all the contrast, the shadows and the lights. You know, you might be really creative and you'd say, well, the shadows are dark, maybe I will use that exposure compensation. You might say that you would use the exposure compensation to lighten up the frame. The problem is that the highlights become blown out highlights. And so you can use your built-in flash to fill in the shadows. And it's a good way to compensate for the extreme light levels at sunlight. Now this camera has lots of different flash modes. And these are some of the different modes that you're going to see, and they have lots of little symbols, so let's just kind of run through what the symbols mean. First off, the lightning bolt is flash, and if you see it on, that means the flash is going to be kind of forced on in a fill flash mode. The flash might be turned off, kind of forced off. You can use the flash at a very slow shutter speed if you want, and that would be a slow sync flash. You have a red eye reduction. If you have children or people that you're taking pictures of that have a red eye problem, you can turn red eye on the flash. The disadvantage is that when you press the shutter release, the actual picture will take about 2 seconds before it'll actually fire the shutter, and so there is a delay. And so it's a little bit harder to capture specific moments because that red eye reduction light comes on to help reduce the pupil size. There is an option of going into rear curtain flash synchronization as opposed to front curtain, which is standard. Automatic flash means the flash will just fire if necessary. And to change these flash modes, what you will do is you will press the button and you will turn the dial in the back of the camera, the main command dial, and you will see the different modes changing up in your LCD panel. At least some of the modes, depending upon what modes we have activated to change. And so that is how you change the flash mode on the camera. Now that button serves as a dual purpose button. It is also flash exposure compensation. And so if you press that button and turn the front dial, you will see a plus and minus turning. And this is similar but different than the previous exposure compensation button that we had talked about. And the reason why you would want to power down or power up the flash is as follows. When you use your camera as a fill-in flash, the pop-up flash, it frequently will fire a little too much power. Technically, it's doing the right amount. It's trying to balance out everything. And in this case, the light doesn't reach the background, and it's trying to compensate for that dark background, and it's overlighting our subject's face. And so you can power down the flash, which I think is a very good thing to do. So here, by powering it down to -1, it's a more natural lighting effect. And so -1 is generally a pretty good place just to leave this all the time. So let's take a look at a bright light situation. Here you can see the camera has done a horrible job at filling in our subject's face. It's overexposed it because she has on a dark sweater and there's a dark background, and the camera is trying to lighten up the face to compensate for all this other darkness. And so in this case, we could do a -1, -2, -3. In this particular case, I think -2 looks the best. But you can be the judge in your own situation as to how far to power the flash down. But just for a more natural look, I would power the flash down when you use the pop-up flash under many situations, especially outdoor daytime type pictures. Personally, I leave my camera, I don't use the built-in flash very often, but I often leave it just at -1 as a standard. And so just a couple of other things about flash. This camera is limited to 1/250th of a second on flash. I should say under normal circumstances. There are some ways to get around it, but that's the maximum shutter speed that your camera will allow. You can't accidentally set 1,000th of a second. Your camera will force you back down at 2/50th, but that's why you can't go above 2/50th. It's just the limit of what it can do. And as I kind of mentioned before, there's a range of about 10 feet, 3 meters or so with this flash. You're not going to be able to fill a large auditorium with this little tiny built-in flash. It's most effective when shooting people that are quite near in front of you, but it can be very handy at doing that. So back over on the left side of the camera, the next button right below that is the BKT, which stands for bracket. And so to work this particular function, you will press this button and you will turn the front dial and you will turn the back dial, and you will select either the number of frames or the range that they will be working in: third stops, full stops, 2 stops. And what this has done is it's basically overexposing and underexposing a series of shots. And so if you're not sure what the correct exposure should be, you could shoot a bracketed series, a group of 3 shots at +1, -1, all the way to -3 to +3, so that you could get a group of shots. Now, some people will also use this for a type of photography called HDR, high dynamic range photography, for quickly having the camera adjust shutter speeds, apertures to get these different values set. And so this is something that you would use in one of the automatic modes like program, aperture priority, shutter priority. It used to be much more important on cameras when we were shooting film because we didn't know the results we were getting. Now this is a feature that I don't personally use very much because I can view the images on the LCD on the back of the camera, and I can look at histograms, and I can see if I got the right exposure right then and there. And so this is not as necessary as it used to be, but it's a handy feature to have, and it's a quick way to make a couple of different exposure adjustments on the fly. Over on the left side, we will have our autofocus and manual focus switch down here. Nikon cameras are a little confusing because there is an autofocus and manual focus switch on the lens, as well as one on the body. And so if you want to be in the autofocus mode, everything needs to be in the A or AF mode. If you want to switch to manual focus, you can just switch one of them. And if it's on your lens, that's probably the better place to do it. On this camera, I would leave it in AF all the time, unless there was a particular lens that didn't work well with. Now, the thing that is a little bit tricky is that there is a button in the middle of that switch. So there's a switch on the outside that kind of controls the master autofocus, manual focus, but inside is the AF area mode. And we've already used this when we were in the live view mode. And so let's talk a little bit more about this focus mode, because this camera has a lot of ways of focusing. So pressing that button and turning the back dial will change the focus mode, and it will change it from AFS, AFC, and AFA, and those stand for single servo, continuous servo, and auto servo. AFS is a good mode to generally keep the camera in. What happens then is when the camera focuses, the camera is going to seek out the sharpest focus. When it finds it, it's going to stop and stay locked on as long as your finger is halfway down on the shutter release. This is a great general purpose system to have your camera in. If you are shooting sports where someone or something is moving forward and away from you, you would want the continuous mode. So if you're shooting something that's moving, AFC is a good mode. Now there is also an AFA mode that will automatically switch back and forth. However, it can be a little inconsistent and is not something that I would recommend for many situations. For instance, if you're shooting basketball, somebody is stopped still on the court, but then they start moving again. If you have it in the AFA mode, it would probably lock in while they stopped and then lock the focus in there so that when they moved, they wouldn't be in focus. In that particular situation, if you knew you were shooting sports, I would leave it in the AFC mode. But for general photography, just kind of walking around basic photography, I would leave it in the AFS mode. Now by pressing that button and turning the front dial, you will choose the area mode, and this is kind of what you are focusing on. Now it depends a little bit on what mode you are in. If you're in the single mode, you can't access all the features, so you might want to change it to the AFC mode so that you can get all the options. So if you go to AFC, pressing the button, turning the back dial, pressing the autofocus button and turning the front dial, you will see these different modes. Single point is one single point. It'll start with the center of the frame, and then you can use the little mouse tab on the back, the multi-controller, to go to different focusing points. There is a dynamic point that we can get, which will adjust it between 9, 21, and 39 points, where the camera will work with as many points as it deems necessary. And this is very good for sports. If you want to shoot, say, a soccer match, I would probably have it in the 39-point dynamic autofocus would be a good system. But they have 9, 21, and 39 for different types of sports and different types of action. There is a 3D tracking mode where it will use color to help track subjects, and so you could also use this along with dynamic. You'd have to test to see which one works best for the subjects that you are photographing. And then finally, there is an auto mode where the camera will just kind of try to figure things out on its own. And that might be good for basic photography, but I prefer to leave it in a single point mode where I can select one individual point and decide what is the most important part that I want in focus. And so I like leaving it at single point and then going back and changing it to AFS for single. So single point autofocus and single servo autofocus is a good way to have good control over your camera, what it's focusing on. The lens that comes supplied in the kit is a vibration reduction lens, and there is a VR switch that turns it on and off on the camera. If you're going to be hand holding the camera, I would generally just leave it on all the time. It doesn't take too much away from the battery power. However, if you do use the camera on a tripod, I would turn it off. There tends to be a problem with the stabilization systems when they're put on a tripod and they're not moving at all. They sometimes will have lens elements that look for movement. And so I would turn it off on a tripod, but when it's handheld, I would keep it on. Next up is the little white dot on the side of the camera. That's your lens mounting index. That's just kind of where you line your lens up to mount it on the camera. And next we have our covers, where we have a number of ways that we can plug things in to the camera. And so to start with, the top button, there's an AV out button. So if you want to output to a TV for a slideshow, you'd plug in the cables, supplied cables for that. There's a USB cable for plugging into the USB port and downloading images to your computer. There's an HDMI port, so if you want to export to an HD TV live feed, you would plug in right there. We have a remote and GPS plug-in down below in the bottom panel. Nikon has a cable remote. I'll tell you which one that is at the end of this class, and that's a cable release. Or you could hook up a GPS unit to it. Nikon has a GPS kind of transponder unit that you can plug in and work with GPS. And then also you have a microphone down there. The built-in microphone is not the most capable microphone, but it's handy. If you want better sound, you can plug in an external microphone. Over on the right-hand side of the camera is the dual card slot. So if you have two cards, and I have two cards here, you can have two cards in the camera simultaneously. And there are some menu settings that we will run by, and this is a really nice feature. Very few cameras can take two cards in it. Now you can set the camera up so that it shoots on card 1, which is the top card, and then when it fills up, it goes to the second card on the bottom. Or you could have it shoot to both cards simultaneously so that things are backed up and potentially you're done with the shoot. You give one card to a client or to a friend and you keep one card and you both have copies. You can set it up to shoot RAW onto one card, JPEGs onto the other. You can shoot stills on one card and movie on the other card. And the first time ever on a camera at this price point, you could be shooting on one card and then bring in a second card, plug it in, and copy all the data from the first card to the second card as a backup. So you don't need to bring a computer to back images up. You would just need a second card. And so it's a great system to have, and I think we'll see more of that in the future on other cameras. Let's look at the front of the camera. There is a light kind of tucked away in there, and it is used for 3 different things. It's a red eye reduction light, so if you do have red eye reduction turned on, there is a light that'll turn on for about 2 seconds when you take the picture. And so this is the delay that I don't particularly like, but it does help reduce red eye. But red eye can also be reduced in software like Lightroom and other programs pretty easily, so it's not as much of a concern as it used to be. In the self-timer mode, the light will come on to let you know when the camera is actually going to fire. It'll blink as it counts down and then will stay steady for the last 2 seconds. And then it's an AF assist light. When it's low light conditions, it'll actually turn on like a flashlight to help the camera focus. Next up is a meter coupling level, and this is just Nikon's way of helping the camera work with older series of lenses. There is an infrared receiver. If you're going to be around the front side of the camera, you want to make sure that infrared receiver is visible to the infrared remote if you're going to use that. We have our built-in microphone right here. It's a decent microphone, but the problem is that it can hear the lens focusing, it can hear you zooming and hand-holding the camera, so it does pick up a lot of vibrations and other sounds. So you do have to be careful about holding the camera properly. Our lens release for taking the lens on and off. Here's our mirror, which is bouncing the light upward so we can see it in the prism. The AF drive shaft is something that the lower models from Canon do not have. This enables you to use this camera with a wider variety of lenses. So you can use this with virtually any autofocus lens Nikon has ever made. So there's a wide variety of new and used lenses that you can use with this camera. Next is this little unlabeled button on the front. It's a depth of field preview button. At least that's the way it comes from the factory. We can get in and we can change the features of this button, and we can have it do one of many different features. But depth of field preview is a good standard one for it to do. And if you're not sure what depth of field preview is, on the left, kind of keep your eyes on the left-hand screen. This is a short video of a lens stopping down to its working aperture. And I'll play this a couple of times. If you'll notice, the image on the right goes from narrow focus to great depth of field as we stop the lens down. So you can stop the lens down to view what the working aperture is if you have an aperture with great depth of field set. So it's a great way for you to just simply press a button and see how much depth of field you're going to get in a particular shot. Once again, this used to be a really important feature on film cameras, and actually now it's pretty easy just to shoot a picture and look at the image on the back of the screen. But if you can't see the screen on the back of your camera, it's a handy feature to have. Next up is the CPU contacts. You can kind of see those in the lens mount. You want to make sure those are clean and free of dust, dirt, and anything else that might be blocking it, because they need to communicate with the lens. And then there's a function button, and this is a button like the depth of field preview that you can program. And when we get to the menu system, you'll be able to program this to do one of any number of about 19 different features, whatever you find most useful. And then here's our sub-command dial that we've kind of already found through other features, but our other main dial for changing things. Now, if you've noticed, on the back of the Nikon camera, there's a couple of red indicators in various areas. There's 2 indicators, and they both say format on them. And if you want to reformat your memory card, you can go into the menu system and do it, but you can also do it directly from these 2 buttons. You hold the 2 buttons for 2 seconds, and then you hold them for another 2 seconds. You can reformat the memory card right then and there without diving into the menu system. And also there's a couple of little green buttons. And if you want to restore kind of the factory default settings on the camera, your 13-year-old cousin got a hold of your camera and went into the menu system and changed everything on you, you could very quickly change that by holding down those two buttons for a couple of seconds, and that resets everything on the camera. Talk about the lens for a moment. The kit lens, the 18-105. Starting with the filter threads at the top, it's a 67 millimeter thread, so if you need a replacement lens cap, you want to get a UV filter, a polarizing filter, 67. This is not the size of all Nikon lenses. You want to check which lens, but with the kit lens, it's a 67. Right around the edges there's some kind of funny bumps, and that's where you would mount the hood. We have our main zoom ring and our focal length indicator. Are we at wide angle or at telephoto? It's how we change it. We have our manual focus ring, so if you manually want to change the focus, you would turn that ring. We have our general lens information. And as I said, we'll talk more about lenses in the accessory section, about what all those little letters mean. Our lens mounting index that we want to make sure gets aligned with the mounting index on the camera. And then, of course, our CPU contacts that match up with the contacts in the camera. And let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the Nikon alphabet soup. Nikon has a lot of different letters that they like to associate with their lenses. And it might be a little confusing to the newcomer to the Nikon system, but they are just trying to identify what lenses do what. And so AF stands for autofocus. That's a pretty easy one. AFS is a newer generation of focus lenses from Nikon. It indicates a silent wave focusing motor that's very quiet and very quick in its focusing. D lenses was something that came about quite some time ago in the early days of autofocus that transmitted distance information from the lens to the body. Generally, you don't see the D on any of the newer lenses. Next up is DX. The camera uses a DX sensor, and so you can use DX lenses or non-DX lenses, which is the rest of the lineup of lenses. But a DX lens indicates that it can only be used with a DX sensor. ED stands for extra low dispersion glass. This is kind of Nikon's code word for good glass. It's something that they've been instituting on more and more of their lenses, but it's generally a good thing that a lens will have ED glass. G is an electronically controlled aperture. A G lens, and the lens that comes supplied is a G lens, does not have an aperture on it, and you cannot use it on a camera that is, say, more than about 10 years old. It is a lens that can only be used on a more modern camera. IF stands for internal focus. A lens with internal focus will probably focus a little bit faster than other lenses because the elements are smaller and on the inside a little bit easier to work back and forth. A lens that says micro is a very general term. It basically means it's good for close-up capability. It doesn't mean it's a macro lens, which is kind of another level up from micro, or a full-on micro lens, but a micro lens is one that is good at close-up work. N is nano crystal coating, which kind of like ED is, but in this case it's a coating that goes on the glass itself, indicates typically a higher end lens. VR is their name for reducing vibration reduction. And then if you kind of see the Mark II, there's a second generation lens. There might have been a previous autofocus generation and they've made improvements on it. And as we go along in time, Nikon is remaking their lenses and making them even sharper. As the resolution of the cameras gets higher and higher, the demand for better lenses is getting higher and higher. And so at this point, we're going to stop and we're going to take some questions because we've been going for a long time. At least it feels like I've been talking continuously forever. So I'm going to take a break and listen to some of your questions. So those of you out in the internet can start sending in your questions, and I think we may have some questions here in class too, and make sure you grab the microphone if you're going to do that.
Oh, we have questions.
We've been going for too long.
Yeah, we've got questions for quite a while, so we have to go back to where we started.
This is a Nikon camera.
Right.
Nikon.
No.
Should we start in the classroom? Are there any in-class questions from anyone?
No.
If you have questions, just kind of raise your hand and pop it around as you get inspired by other questions.
Yes.
So go ahead and let's get started.
Okay, let's roll. First question from Joish. If I'm starting over system-wise, what would lead me towards Nikon rather than Canon? Most of what I hear about now is Canon. I do care about video.
Okay. Well, that's kind of a tough question. Nikon and Canon are the two most popular systems out there. I have owned Nikon, I have owned Canon. They are both really good systems. And a lot of people, the way that they buy cameras is they figure out how much they want to pay, and they look at Canon and Nikon, and they do a comparison between the two cameras, and they pick the best camera. And it's not a wholehearted bad way to pick a camera, but you are ending up in a system, and as you buy more lenses and more cameras, you get more and more dedicated to that system. It's almost like moving to a city. You really want to choose what system overall you want to be a part of. Right now, when you take a look at the Nikon D7000 and you compare it with comparable other models out there, it compares very favorably with the features that it has for the price. And so I could very easily see how someone would come to the conclusion that this camera is the best camera at this price. So that's one reason why you might consider this. Some people prefer certain lens choices with Nikon and or Canon. Personally, I think it's kind of a 50-50 split. They both have some cool lenses that aren't available to the other group. If you get into a Nikon system, you're getting into one of the most popular systems out there. There's tons of people out there with equipment. There's tons of stores that have gear. There's tons of other people selling and buying used equipment. So if you change your mind, there's people who can buy it. If you want to pick up used gear, you can pick up used gear. You're getting into a very, very common system. And so I really will never be pushed into a corner saying you must buy a Nikon unless they give me such a long laundry list of features and specifications that they need that only this camera has. So it's a great camera. It's probably the best camera at its price, but it's very carefully placed in the market compared to other models so that it does fit that regard of a best value at that price.
Yeah, I know.
Thanks, John.
Personally, when I get that question, I just ask three things. What's your price range? What do you need it to do? And how does it work for you, like ergonomically? Like go put them in your hands and play around with them and get a feel for what works for you. So.
Some people really take a liking to the way the buttons and features work on the camera. I've used both, and I think most people would be comfortable with either one. It's just a matter of getting used to it. But some people just inherently like the way a certain camera feels.
Right.
And if you're a touchy-feely person and that's really important to you, and you really like one, go for it, because that's an important thing to you.
So very, very true. Let's see. Someone's asking about the video frame rates. Are you going to talk about that at some point?
A little bit. I'll just mention it a little bit now.
Okay.
There is a limitation on what frame rates you can choose on the camera. Depending on if you are in a PAL or an NTS system will depend on which frame rates you get to choose. For instance, 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second. Are you at 30 frames per second? Those are some of the more common rates. This camera, the minor shortcoming of it is that if you want to shoot it in full HD, which is 1920 by 1080, you can't shoot it at 30 frames per second. You can shoot it at 24 frames a second, which is the way they shoot Hollywood movies, but not the way they shoot TV. If you want to shoot 30 frames a second, you have to shoot it in HD, not full HD, which is the 720 mode rather than the 1080 mode. And so if that was all gibberish to you, take a look at the video section of it. But in general, it shoots very good video, but it's not everything that the full videographer might want.
Comment from G2 in the chat room. She says, buying a camera is like wedding into a family. You have to like the aunts and uncles and cousins to have a good holiday.
That's very good.
It's cute. So I have a question from Tom in SF. How can you adjust aperture when shooting in live view?
Adjusting aperture in live view. One of the things that you would have to do is get into the menu system and change the mode, the video mode, to manual as opposed to auto. And we haven't gotten there yet. It can be done, and we will get in there and show you how to change it into the manual mode. So you have to get into the menu system where it controls the video and change that to manual. And then you can set the camera fully manually.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have quite a few more questions here. Moving right along.
They're just stumbling over the fact that they have so many
I know,
questions
it's
to choose
true.
from.
Yeah, there's a ton. It's like, where do we go next? Where do we go next? Let's see here.
As Factor would like to know, what is the advantage of the top control panel as opposed to viewing that information on the back main display?
Well, the fact of the matter is that, and very much right after this section, we're going to get into how the information is displayed to the user. And there are sometimes bits of information that are displayed in 3 different ways. When you look through the viewfinder of the camera, on the top LCD, as well as the info in the back screen. And it all depends on where you like to see that information. So a bunch of that is going to be duplicated, if not triplicated, depending on how you like to view it. Because some people will view it on a tripod, and they'll just hit the info button and they can see it, which is kind of nice if you have the camera in a very high position. Sometimes you're in a low position and you don't want to tilt the camera around. So just more information, the better access you have to it.
So go ahead and say it, John. There's a slide for that.
There is a slide for that.
Later.
We
folks.
joke in my classes that
Yeah.
there's apps for that at Apple, but here with John, there's a slide for
He's
that.
a David Beckham of slides.
So we will have a visual to go along with that.
Another quick question on video. I know that there's some limitations on how long you can record. Is that more based on the card or the camera itself?
I think the camera itself puts a limitation on it because it is 20 minutes at full resolution. I don't think you can get even further than that with low resolution. But the instruction manual is a little unclear because it says approximately 20 minutes. And I'm surprised that the engineers did not have a more exact number or do something more exacting with it. But I'm not sure why that is. You would have to talk to the technicians, but that's what the instruction manual indicates, is 20 minutes. But that's a pretty long video for a continuous take.
Abram would like to know, is it possible to connect headphones while shooting video in order to hear what's being recorded?
There's no headphone jacks on the camera, so it does not have that option. If you're just diving into the world of DSLR video, it's a very poor video camera. In some ways it's great, but in some ways it's poor. It just doesn't have a lot of the controls that you would expect on a full bore video camera. What makes it a great video camera is that it's got a large sensor, it's a small camera, you can change lenses on it, and it's pretty affordable. But as far as the features and the functions for shooting video, it's very, very limited. And so to make it work in video often requires a lot of other equipment. And so what they may need is may need an external microphone with an external recording device that they can plug headphones into, and then they will take that audio sync and they will match it to the video sync of the camera. And so to really do that top-notch professionally requires a lot of stuff.
Add-ons, add-ons, add-ons. About the 9-point focusing mode, can the control dial on the back be used to move that focusing point around?
In the 9-point mode, that I don't think of, but let me just give this a real quick try here. Let me set it to continuous. Go down to the 9-point mode, which chooses the 9 points in the middle. Now see, that's actually changing the center. Let's see here. No, that's just going to select the 9 in the middle.
Okay.
Ear Sales would like to know, how do flash techniques, fill flash, exposure control, etc. work in conjunction with face priority mode?
Face priority mode is strictly focusing, and so the two are very separate mechanisms within the camera. The face priority mode for live view and for movie will identify and track and try to focus sharply on that. And you know, I haven't tried this. Let's give this a live try because I know a lot about this camera, but I do not know everything. So I'm going to try to shoot a flash picture in live view. So I will pop up the flash and let's see if this will fire. It does fire. So something that I will mention is that, let's see, where's my live view? Wow, shut down on me. It didn't like that. It did not shut down on me. Nothing went wrong with the camera. I had the camera in mirror lockup from when the time we were in another mode. Okay, so I have it in live view. I'm going to pop up the flash, and the flash, there we go. Focus in. So you can use flash with live view. if you're recording video, I'll bet you that you can't fire the flash. Well, actually, you might be able to. Let's see. Hopefully it will. Yes. So what I did right there is I was recording a video, and I pressed down on the shutter release. This is primarily designed as a still photography camera. So Nikon's thinking is that if you're shooting movies and you want to take a still picture, just press the shutter release, you're going to get a picture. And so what it does is it stops recording the movie and then goes into the picture taking mode right away. And so at any time you're recording a movie and you want to record a still frame, you can do that. But the movie will be stopped, and that'll finish. You'll stop the video recording and then fire the flash. But back to the original question, I don't know that I would be using this camera with live view and the flash. It's a little bit hard to work with, in my opinion, but it can technically be done.
Okay, next question. Next question. Shasta would like to know, can you take stills while shooting video?
You can't, well, like I just did there, you can shoot stills, but it stops the video recording.
Okay.
So you can't shoot them simultaneously.
Did you just answer that question?
I
Kind of
wasn't even asked the question, but I answered it because I knew it was coming
All
up.
right, well, now we have clarification.
Right.
Rita would like to know what external microphone you would recommend to get better audio.
External microphones, there's a lot to choose from. I have a little Sennheiser that costs about $200. I don't have it in the accessory section, but it's a pretty small one. There's another very good one from Rode. So Sennheiser and Rode are two ones that have good microphones that aren't too big.
Awesome, thank you.
I'll recommend something.
Oh, here we go.
Zoom H4n. This is just all-in-one microphone.
Okay, is that a recording device as well?
Yeah, it's a recording device.
Okay.
It works really, really well.
Yeah,
I know
familiar with those.
that one's been mentioned in the Final Cut Pro class that we've been also having here at Creative Live, so just saying.
And Adam did recommend some mics to me last week.
Can
so
you share them? Oh.
No, private.
He's telling me I should be able to answer that question. The Rhodes was one that he
Rode.
recommended, and there was another one that we named both of them.
Rode, Sennheiser,
Sennheiser, that was the one.
and Zoom. It's Z-O-O-M, right?
Yes.
So you can check those
H4n.
up at B&H.
B&H,
Right.
B&H Video.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, moving right along, John, let's ask some more questions. Okay.
A couple of questions on bracketing. One is, can you change the order in which bracketed images are taken?
Yes, you can. Normally when you bracket, it shoots, okay, I'm testing my memory here, a normal exposure, an underexposure, and then an overexposure. And if you would prefer to see it in the under, normal, over, we'll hit that when we go through the menu system.
So Abrams asks, so what other settings need to be in place to get bracketing to work?
Say that again?
What other settings need to be in place to get bracketing to work?
Well, let's see. Okay, so if you're in the green auto mode, you have the child safety locks turned on, so you can't do bracketing at that point. So you can't be in the auto mode. You can't be in the scene mode. You probably want to be in either the PS or A mode. And while it can be set in manual, I'm not sure why it would, because you can just do that by turning the dials on their own. So it's mainly going to be of use in the PS and A mode for program, shutter priority, and aperture priority. You could have it set in any focus mode you want, but it might be good to have it set in manual focus so that it doesn't refocus. Let's see what other things. Those are some of the highlight ones that I would think about.
Okay. Kaothea would like to know, does the AF assist light only turn on when you're using the center AF point like on other bodies, like the D200 and D300s?
Ooh, I don't know. Let's see if I can make that happen right now. So I'm going to choose autofocus single, and I'm going to make sure that I'm in one point in the middle, and let's just see if this light comes on. Make sure that my lens is in autofocus. Okay, it did come on there, right? And let's turn it over here. And if I bring the center post back to the middle, it did come on. So if you choose anything outside the center, it will not come on. So you have to be focused on the center. And if you're not sure if you're in the center, you can just press the OK button on the back, and that gets your center point centered to the center point. If you are in the mode where you're choosing a single point and it's way off to one side, you can just press the OK button and the point goes right back to the center, because you remember that you use the touchpad back here for selecting where that single point is. Right, the center, press that, gets it centered back to the middle again.
Okay, Janice C. had asked, will you be covering how to shoot stills on one card and video on the other?
We will pass by that in the video mode, but basically there is a setting in the menu system where it asks you, where do you want the video files put? Do you want them on the main card or do you want them on a secondary card? And we'll pass by that. So we're going to take this big tour of the menu system, and we're going to be like we're walking through the mall, and I'm going to be like, well, that's where this is, and that's where this is, and we're not going to be able to go in and investigate everything, but we'll go in and take a look at the most important things.
Just one more quick question before we move on, unless you have even more. Someone's asking about the best technique when you're hand-holding in a large lens to change the ISO or maybe some of the other settings on the camera that are like back here while you're trying to hold and like...
Right, yeah, that could be one of the reasons for customizing. Remember when we went by the front of the camera, I talked about we can customize these, and we'll be getting into that very soon here.
Okay, and the
that
menu.
Potentially, you know, if you're having your hands out here, you can customize these buttons in front, which are a little bit easier to get to. And you could customize one of them for ISO, I believe. We'll find.
I think I saw something in the menu about that.
I don't recall the 19 different features that you can put in there, but I'm pretty
Right.
sure that's got to be one of them. And so that would be one technique, so that you don't have to go back there to change the white balance, ISO, or quality.
Perfect.
Whatever it is that you change the most.
So there's a couple more questions that we can move on if you're ready, John.
Let's take a few more questions.
Okay. Abby would like to know if you can show a demo of the Q mode.
The Q mode.
Yeah, that's what it says. Don't know what that is?
Oh, no.
No?
I
No
think
such thing as a
that's
Q
more
mode?
of a, well, we're not even going to mention the brand name, but it's a brand other than
Nikon?
Nikon.
Nikon? No.
I don't-
that has a Q mode in it.
Okay.
And
There's nothing comparable?
well, wait. Maybe they mean the quiet mode.
Oh, you know what? I think that is what it is. 'Cause
Okay.
Yeah. That
Okay.
question
All right.
goes back a ways.
Okay,
does.
because there's a
They
Q,
do.
there's a Q feature on a different camera.
So there's
So
a Q
I'm going to
mode.
hold this camera really close to my microphone, and I'm just
Here we
going to
go.
fire the normal shutter release. Now I'm going to put it in the Q mode. So it makes a slightly different sound, but it is quieter.
But it sounds a little weird.
It sounds a little weird. That might attract more attention. You know, it's
Is there something wrong?
it's slower. It's a lot slower. Correct.
Okay, one more question from Tia. When I hold down white balance, it shows a question mark and talks about high key definition. How do I get out of question mark mode and into the white balance info?
She's in a menu
She's
mode.
probably in menu mode.
Okay,
If she
yeah.
gets out of menu mode, then the white balance button works.
Okay. Did you get that, Tia?
So if she presses the info button on the back of the camera to kind of turn the screen off and back, the white balance mode is then activated. It's a dual purpose button, and so if you're in the menu system and that LCD on the back of the camera is on and you're in looking at something, then that becomes the question and help button. When it's turned off, it's for using white balance. So it's kind of like, are you shooting the camera is the camera more in a shooting mode or in a doing something other than the shooting mode?
Okay, I can ask another question. I love questions.
Yeah.
My name would like to know, what does low mean in aperture mode if the camera selected shutter speed is within camera range at 1/100th to 1/4 of a second, visible only after reviewing the metadata in playback?
So if it is showing low, it is a low amount of light, so low that it can't shoot a picture. This will also happen actually somewhat frequently if you have it in shutter priority mode. And so you're going to need to make a fairly major change either with the ISO or with the setting that you do have access to. And so It means you're way, way off on exposure with letting in the correct amount of light. With aperture priority though, and this is one of the reasons why I like aperture priority rather than shutter priority, is in aperture priority, there's pretty much always a correct shutter speed. And so just in here we have a variety of some very bright lights and some darker areas, and I will have, I have it set at ISO 100, and I'll point it up here towards a bright light, and I have up around 500th of a second, and then if I point it down here, I'll get down to 1/4 of a second. I put my hand in front of the lens, I'm down at 4 or 5 seconds, and I still haven't got a low reading until I completely block the light. And you can see maybe in the overhead camera here how it's gone down to low. But if I take my hand off, suddenly I have shutter speeds like a 1/2 second or a full second. And so it just means that they need to let in more light, one way or the other.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say that Tia is in the chat room, and she says, thanks for answering my white balance question. It worked.
Good. Always
So
good to
great.
hear that we got the right answer in one way or the other.
Yeah, people are liking all the answers, so.